Now, we haven't talked about frameworks, but there's a lot in common between Bootstrap and Font Awesome in terms of implementation. The idea behind both of them is that we should be able to add classes to our HTML in order to quickly style that HTML in a predictable, consistent way. So for example, here are some buttons, and they look pretty good. The markup for this button would look like this. Here's an A tag, and we're going to add a couple of classes, one button, and then button-danger. And then within the button, we would use an empty tag here. In this case, it's using the I or italic tag simply because it's short. And we're adding the class FA in order to bring in the Font Awesome base, the class for the icon itself, FA-O, and then a class to resize that icon, FA-LG. And then here's the text delete and the ending tag. Now, there are a lot of benefits to this approach, and at some point you're likely going to evaluate Bootstrap as a possible solution to one of your projects. So here's the short version of the pros and cons of doing that, and the same pros and cons apply to using Font Awesome in its entirety. The benefits are that there's a lot you can do in HTML proper just by adding existing classes. This usually means quicker prototyping because you can build some pretty amazing components with just a few CSS classes. As we know from working without a framework like this, it can take a while to get the CSS just right. Another benefit is consistency. So as you can see with all of these components here, there's consistency on a lot of levels. The same colors are being used. The color palette matches pretty well, even with the different colors. The icons are consistent. The borders, the margin between items. There's a lot of work that's been done into making these components consistent and fairly easy to use. And also, frankly, attractive. So those are all the pros. And so here are the cons. The first is that we get a lot of CSS that we don't need in our project. So we might only use a handful of icons, but we have the CSS to use every single icon, so there's some code bloat there. Secondly, when it comes to modifying these to create a custom look, you'll end up doing a lot of overriding. And as we've talked about extensively before, when you're overriding styles that you yourself have added to your project, that's the sign of some problems in your code. In some cases, it makes sense, but it also means that your code is going to be less sustainable. If you can't just look at your CSS and know which styles are additive and which are overriding existing styles, it will be very hard to clean up later on. Now, if your project can use Bootstrap without having to modify any of the components, then you're in good shape for that one. But most of the time, that's not going to be the case. Most clients will have requirements that don't fit exactly into the Bootstrap framework. A third problem is semantics. So if we look at this button right here, we have a whole bunch of classes that don't necessarily tell us a lot about the intention of this button. FA, FA large, and to some extent FA-O, none of these give additional meaning to this element. It tells us the way it should look, but there's many benefits to using classes as identifiers instead of as a way to categorize what kind of CSS it's going to pull in. As I've mentioned a couple of times, screen readers can use classes in order to find out more about an element, and classes like this are not going to be useful at all. One final thing with semantics is that here we have a button that's an A tag, which is totally legitimate, that's what we've been doing, but then the icon is being represented by using an I tag, when really this icon probably should be part of the CSS of the A tag. Now we could probably tweak this to get that kind of structure, but as you can see from the examples, this is the suggested structure, and so the creators are assuming you're going to use a structure similar to this, and it's just not semantic. So what you'll find is that beginning front-end developers will get a lot of value from Bootstrap because they'll be able to fairly rapidly template beautiful and consistent designs. However, at some point, they'll likely be burned by a project where they had to do a lot of modifications of the default framework. And then, God forbid, if they have to go into that project a year or two later, it might be really hard to figure out which styles are still applicable and which ones aren't. So more experienced front-end developers tend to gravitate away from frameworks like Bootstrap because they can get more control over their CSS and their markup. They figure out what kinds of principles they can apply across all projects and what's unique to each project. With a framework like Bootstrap, you make a lot of assumptions about what you're going to need down the road with the project.